But one of the things that's really important now is now that people understand kind of how carbon removal can be a complement, not a substitute to the rest of our decarbonization efforts, we actually have to do this. And that requires two things. History would suggest it requires two things. The first is a massive increase in funding for innovation. When I started talking to policymakers on this topic, direct air capture had literally never gotten any funding appropriated by Congress in the US. This year, there's $3.5 billion of funding for the solution in the infrastructure bill that was just passed. So we're starting to make good progress there. The National Academies did a study in 2018 that said 3.5 billion is a good start, but just that we're going to need between 10 and $25 billion over the next decade to bring not just direct air capture, but the full suite of solutions to scale. And so we're still continuing to push on that. I've actually been really heartened to see an enormous increase in private capital join public capital. We now have venture investors who are putting tens to hundreds of millions of dollars of private capital to work in the field. And so I think we're actually starting to see a fairly robust ecosystem of early stage solutions that can get to that kind of 4,000 ton per year scale with that existing innovation funding. But as we've seen, deployment and scale is what matters. And that's not going to happen without further policy change. We see that we need to both have incentives to actually get projects built when the private sector is not willing to pay for them according to their own kind of existing cost benefit analyses. But we also need to have a robust regulatory structure, both to make sure that these projects happen in a safe and equitable way, but also that they happen, because regulatory delays can be a huge issue for getting many of these solutions to scale. Okay. So right now, our organization is working on 5 big pillars of policy change that we think are essential to getting carbon removal to scale. I've already mentioned innovation. We simply need to get the amount of funding from governments around the world at the scale that's required. But that foundation is a bridge to nowhere unless there's a customer, which is why we think procurement is one of the most important pieces and really the future of the conversation on carbon removal. This is something where it's kind of obvious to the Silicon Valley community, where even if you have the best widget, it's not worth anything unless there's a customer. And right now, there's not a customer for carbon removal. We see a lot of companies paying for kind of tens of thousands to even up to millions of tons cumulatively is a reasonable trajectory for the field. But there's no way that companies are going to voluntarily pay the tens and then hundreds of billions of dollars required to clean up their mess. That's where government has to come in. And this is something that the US government actually is one of the biggest customers in the world. There's no reason that it can't join private industry in purchasing carbon removal and helping us get to scale. Part of the thing that I think is most counterintuitive about this approach is the fact that it's so unfamiliar within the climate policy conversation. 15 years ago, when I started working on climate policy was carbon tax. It was cap and trade. It eventually became tax credits here in the United States. The idea that procurement and purchasing would be the main demand driver is something that was completely off the table at the time. Yet when it comes to carbon removal, which unlike clean energy, unlike electric transportation and electric heavy industry, doesn't have an existing market, government plays a particular role of having to be the customer as well as the innovation funder. We see this in a similar way to waste management, that at the end of the day, we pay to clean up our trash. This is something where governments have a wide range of solutions, from either having public sector sanitation departments to kind of bidding it out to private sector consultants. But it's actually a fairly common model when we think about the space industry, for example. Government is a huge customer here. And NASA's budget is roughly the same size as what we're going to ultimately need for cleaning up the atmosphere here on Earth, so our planet remains habitable. A key piece of that is, beyond simply being a customer, there are a lot of fairly unsexy things that end up being incredibly important to the field in the near term. We need to have good carbon accounting standards. We need to have good standards for what it means for projects to actually support communities and advance equity. We need funding for things that individual companies aren't going to build. Things like carbon storage sites, things like roads to help get to ecosystems that we can reforest. All of these things are incredibly important and need to be built up alongside of an industry that must emerge in decades, not centuries, like we've seen the Industrial Revolution play out. The last piece is finance. That at the end of the day, the private sector is very conservative when it comes to new technologies. We've seen that over and over again with the clean energy industry. So there's a huge role for helping the private sector deploy the capital that it needs to, both through tax incentives as well as various types of capital preservation techniques, loan guarantees, and kind of the clean energy playbook that we've seen before. And I mentioned this earlier, but I think it's really important to mention this again, which is because we are at such a nascent state in the field, that there is an opportunity to do carbon removal well, that we can embed equity for communities. We can figure out how to get community benefit agreements. We can figure out how to make sure that there's fair labor standards and fair trade standards associated with these projects. But that doesn't happen on its own. And I would say that's actually something that tends to not happen at all without a really robust civil society engagement. And so it's something that for us is becoming increasingly important. When we started, again, we were very much simply talking about carbon removal at all as being the frontier of the conversation. Now our organization is increasingly shifting to figure out how we can not just talk about carbon removal, but talk about how we do it well and make sure that that is something that happens, and that our voice in civil society make sure that this is not something that companies can use as an excuse to not do emission reductions, for example. Let's see. And I think one of the more kind of surprising things, to be honest, for somebody who's been working on this for the better part of a decade at this point, is how quickly the conversation has changed at the highest levels of climate politics. That when we started as an organization, this was something that junior staffers who worked on science policy were talking about. The fact that John Kerry, the climate envoy for the US right now, would bring this up at the White House Climate Summit last year was completely improbable even 5 years ago. And part of that is why we need to get to work. That I think the rest of the world has started to catch up with the idea that we need carbon removal. But what we haven't seen is a similar increase in resources devoted to making that happen. This graph is one that to me feels crazy, but I feel as the chief fundraiser for our organization all the time. This is from a 2020 report that the Climate Works Foundation did, where I think it's actually less than 2% of climate philanthropy over the past 5 years, or the 5 years to 2020, went to carbon removal, which is nuts. That there is no way that policy is A, going to happen, let alone B, happen in an equitable and robust way without civil society engaged in this. And so while Carbon180 is looking to scale up ourselves, what we think is even more important is for the field to catch up. That for every one Carbon180er that's out here, we need to have 10 others, not just in the US, but around the world. And so this is something that I think is incredibly important for not just our organization to be able to scale and achieve our kind of narrow focus on the US, but for there to be Carbon180 equivalents around the world. It's really exciting to see organizations like Carbon Gap start to emerge in the UK. But there are dozens of other countries around the world where I think there's a big opportunity for carbon removal, both on the political landscape, but also on the technological front. There is just a wealth of innovation happening all across the world. And I think it's really, really important to expand quickly. So I know I've done a ton of talking. I haven't seen all too many questions, but maybe I can pause here and turn it over to the group for questions. James, do you want to go ahead and read your question?
Lucas actually had one first. Lucas, do you want to read yours out if you're up for that? And then I can do my one. Maybe people can read those out if they're okay with that.
Oh, I see that. Yeah. Go ahead, Lucas.
Yeah, he's here. Here we go.
I'm not sure if you can hear me. I'm like in a noisy spot.
I think it's all good. Yeah, go for it. If not, I'll go afterwards.
Yeah, all right. So yeah, my question is like, obviously you're focusing on the US, or you're based in the US, and I was just thinking that maybe, there are some countries that are maybe a bit more conducive to such a policy change, and maybe it would be nice to get the ball rolling in some other country. Yeah, so what's your thoughts on that? Thanks.
So my thought is kind of yes, and I think the US is actually a surprisingly strong political candidate for this work. That we've seen bipartisan agreement on carbon removal in Congress over the past 5 years, which I don't think you can say for many other domains of climate policy here in the US, just recognizing how much of a mess the US national political landscape is right now. So given that there have been billions of dollars of innovation funding, big incentives for carbon removal deployed, it actually is a promising venue, which is part of the reason why we're focused there and so excited about the future. That said, there are a number of other places where this is very exciting to me. I look at state and provincial governments that are aggressive climate champions starting to say, hey, we need to not just get to net zero, but go net negative after that. California is an example there. We've seen even national governments around the world. Sweden is an early example that has said the same thing. And then we've seen the technology development take off in a number of places. The UK is certainly one. They have a greenhouse gas removal innovation program that's starting to fund science and early stage technology demonstrations focused explicitly on this topic. But the fact that there is now a clean energy ministerial dialogue, so kind of an energy minister level conversation dedicated to carbon removal, I think there are dozens of countries from the Middle East to other European technology leaders that are already engaged. And my hope is that that's going to expand significantly to include leaders from the global South, where there is an enormous potential to kind of slingshot and be one of the places that becomes an industrial hub for carbon removal. So it's hard to narrow down because the field is so wide open today, but I would say it's pretty optimistic from where I sit. James, go ahead.
Yeah, cool. Mine's a few questions kind of rolled into one. I guess it's like, where do you think the public opinion on carbon removal is now? It's kind of one. Two, how important do you think that is in terms of affecting policy? And three, I guess how much of the public opinion influencing is Carbon180 trying to do, or is it primarily the policy, like direct policymaker advocacy side of things?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I would say the public understanding is almost non-existent. This has been an extremely technical and niche piece of the conversation. When it is understood or when it is talked about, there's often a conflation with different types of carbon capture. So people often think, oh, coal power plants with carbon capture, which similar-ish technology on some levels, but no, it's very different overall solution for what you would need, why you would need it, how you get it scaled up, right? So for that reason, we really haven't focused on a mass mobilization campaign. What we have found is that where climate policymakers are concerned, they are actually getting incredibly knowledgeable about this and have the nuance associated to make good policy at this point. And so we've really focused on that kind of grass tops, I would say, working with other civil society organizations that focus on climate policy, but really trying to get policymakers themselves to understand this work. Because part of the challenge is it really is a nascent field. And so we can't go to policymakers and say, you're going to create millions of jobs tomorrow with the right stroke of the pen. This is something where policymakers need to see the next generation and helping to create a transition for people who are working in the fossil fuel heavy communities today, or really the carbon intensive industries, agriculture, forestry. How do we transition all of these sectors and use all that skills, accumulated human capital and knowledge towards, instead of extracting carbon, to pulling it out of the air and putting it back away, cleaning it up. And so it's that transformation that's required, where it makes it challenging to mobilize the general public on this, because that will be something that in a decade or so, I think is essential. But today, it's less of a pain point than, say, getting good healthcare, which we still struggle with here in the United States to an unacceptable degree. So I think staying focused on that kind of policymaker education is where we likely will be for the indefinite future.
Well, that makes sense. Maybe before we go to Matthew's point, I think below Barney had a kind of relate to that point is, I guess if you could quickly run through and maybe clear up like the 5 different kinds of carbon removal you laid out in your initial slide, and maybe a bit more detail into each of those things and how they're different to maybe CCS and other technologies.
Yeah, happy to. I guess the thing that I would say for carbon removal solutions is they all share one fundamental characteristic, which is they're not trying to stop carbon from entering the atmosphere. They're trying to take carbon that has already been put into the atmosphere and put it back. And so in many cases, carbon removal looks very similar to climate solutions that we might be more familiar with. We've been conserving forests for decades, essentially paying people to not cut their forest down. That's a great way to avoid carbon going into the atmosphere. The flip side of that coin is we can plant new forests or plant forests in places that have been chopped down over the past. That's how we focus on that second side of the equation. And we see that kind of parallel through all of the different solutions. Things like point source carbon capture are about using fossil energy, but not having the carbon emissions. We are focused on okay, how do you use renewable energy and pull the carbon out of the atmosphere from the fossil fuels in the past? We like to say it's we don't have a time machine, so we have to figure out how to do this with clean energy and at scale. I can share a link here too. There's now an enormous amount of resources available to folks that want to kind of double click on any of this that I would have loved to have 6-7 years ago when we were starting. The one place that I point to is the carbon dioxide removal primer, which is all available publicly online and has an enormous wealth of information in it directly, but also links to all of the relevant resources that are out there.
Cool, that's great. And then I think the next question was from Matthew more on the actual specifics about technology innovation and what kind of things you're asking the government to fund. And he lists a few things that I'm not familiar with, so maybe I'll let you take this one. I don't know if you can see the question.
Yeah, so again, this gets into a whole bunch of wonky detail. I can share the National Academy study on this, but it's the entire gamut of technology innovation. On the nature-based side, it's doing science to understand carbon cycles through soils, through forests better. It's understanding how to enhance photosynthesis and grow deeper roots. On the technology side, it's a lot of systems engineering, it's a lot of material science. The technology that we're using is not particularly advanced. It's pretty similar to the technology that we have to clean CO2 out of submarines, out of the space station. So this stuff has been around for decades. Certainly there have been advances, but I think with the enormous revolutions that we've seen around computational power, material science, even biotech, there's just a huge wealth of innovation that has yet to be unlocked because there's been so little attention, let alone funding in the field. So it's kind of all of the above.
Cool. And Gloria has an interesting question about what role do you think the oil majors have to play in carbon removal? Both what do you actually expect them to do and what do you think their obligation is?
And just to add on that, sorry, I might have missed this during your talk, but can you talk to the argument that they have the kind of technological capacity and the prior infrastructure to do this better than other companies?
Yeah, they certainly do. That if oil companies remotely wanted to do carbon removal at scale, they have the human capital, financial capital, and political capital to make this happen faster than anybody. I think the real question is, how do they do that? And that involves a number of different dimensions. So one of those dimensions is oil and gas companies, for the most part, want to keep making oil and gas. And so they're very hesitant to do anything that would prevent them from doing that. And so I think there's just a huge resistance for them to actually be good climate actors. We've seen a group like Exxon, for example, the biggest oil company here in the US, they said that they were going to invest $3 billion in carbon capture and storage, not even direct air capture, which is an enormous investment. Absolutely. But when they say that they're going to invest $500 billion in continued oil and gas production over that same time frame, it just shows that companies like that are not serious about this at all. And so it's a question of, one, what is actually realistic for these companies to do? And then two, it goes back to the point of how these companies develop carbon removal today is really important. If these companies use it as an excuse to continue to emit carbon and not do anything about the root of the problem, that's not acceptable. If these companies continue to, say, commit human rights violations around the world where they operate and employ poor labor practices, there's just a whole host of reasons why you wouldn't want oil and gas companies to just do what they're doing today, but switch the direction that the carbon is flowing. So part of the reason why I'm really excited to see the venture community invest so much in this space is just that. It's more players who think about this problem differently. And it feels to me a little bit like Tesla in the automotive space, which before Tesla, you had stories like EV1 getting killed, not because the technology didn't work, but because the business model looked less lucrative. When you have competitors come along, that's no longer possible. And so you see the automotive industry kind of overnight change their tune and all talk about electric vehicles. I don't want to be Pollyannish and say that that's going to happen in the carbon removal space, but I certainly see the startup community being absolutely essential to making sure that this field emerges at all, let alone at the speed or with the quality that we would hope. And I guess what is their obligation? That's a great question. I think given how much they knew about climate change and continue to directly lie about it and then not do anything, they should bear a pretty large responsibility for cleaning this up. You could see that this eventually, in the same way that when tobacco companies lied about the impact of their product on public health, they had to pay damages for that. Realistically, the politics are nowhere near that kind of moral standard. And I don't expect that to be part of the political conversation, at least in the kind of OECD set of countries anytime soon.
And then, yeah, Herbie's next question was about, I guess, what do you see as the primary bottleneck to scaling up carbon removal? Was in terms of like research and innovation, or is it capital and funding, or the regulatory approval? I guess, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it's simple. It's a customer, that there's not enough people who want to buy high quality carbon removal. I think as soon as you have a commitment to this field, if either people say, we are going to not just get to zero, but start cleaning up our legacy carbon emissions today, overnight, you will see a transformation in the field, because there already is that innovation capital to at least a certain degree that's anticipating that customer being here. But we certainly don't see a big enough demand. And the kind of biggest latent pool for that is the net piece of net zero, where people are going to continue to say, I'm going to be net zero in only a decade or two, but continue to essentially pay other people to not emit as opposed to directly clean up. Carbon removal is really going to struggle to gain a foothold in that market. We're going to need to have a race to the top in terms of quality when it comes to net zero, which is certainly not where the field is at today. It's very, very kind of Wild West and early days when it comes to the substance of doing net zero well.
Cool. I actually have one question I'm going to slip in if that's okay. I have like, on that public opinion question, I have this almost concern that similar to, I guess you might say that like the some climate groups, maybe like some Sunrise chapters, maybe Greta Thunberg has expressed kind of like skepticism around about carbon capture and storage, and I'm worried that might leak over into like carbon removal technologies because people say, oh, it's just an excuse, you can keep emitting as long as we'll remove it later. I guess is that, and like I guess the worry is that that could be almost like an anti-nuclear kind of level of green movement. And I guess have you ever thought about that kind of effect, and are you kind of thinking about that and how that could play out in terms of like an anti-carbon removal green movement?
Yeah, of course. And I think they're right to be skeptical given the fossil fuel industry's take on this to date. But at the same time, the climate math no longer gives us the option of developing carbon removal. We're going to have to do this to meet our goals. So to me, this feels a little bit like the arguments that people brought up about seatbelts, where if you're wearing a seatbelt, there's moral hazard that you'll drive more dangerously because you get in a crash. And no, just don't drive dangerously. Like there's a whole bunch of ways that you can have laws, cultural norms, a whole range of tools, but it's up to civil society and it's up to policymakers to make sure that the way that these solutions get deployed points in that positive direction, doesn't end up. So I think it's really smart and important to call out how this gets deployed incorrectly, but it's not fundamental to the solution that it will inevitably go wrong. It's up to us. And so we as an organization choose to engage in making sure that this happens well, not that this simply doesn't happen at all out of fear that if it does, it might end up happening poorly.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you. And then Matthew's got a more technical question, which is about, I guess, in terms of, sink limitations where all this carbon gets stored. I don't know if you've seen that question about, locations for storing carbon as well.
Yeah, so it's a great question. The sink limitations are not the really relevant constraint at this point. There's way more carbon storage capacity than we need, which is a great thing. I think there are specific sinks that are challenging. For example, the idea of taking carbon and sequestering it in our built environment is one that's really exciting. It has an economic angle to it that it's not just a pure cleanup play, but as I mentioned earlier, we simply emit way more carbon and have emitted way more carbon than we build stuff every year. So it's a great stepping stone, not an end market. So it's one of the pieces that I'm way less worried about than I am the demand side of how do we actually get this started.
And then I think Roger's left, but Beson's got a question about, I guess, are you primarily working with governments, or I guess are you working with private capital? And I guess I had a similar question in terms of how do you see the primary role being public capital now to almost start that learning curve, and then later on, then private capital comes in when it's a bit more cost effective? Or what are your thoughts around that?
Yeah, it's actually an iterative thing. There's no one answer. At the end of the day, the public sector is going to be required for scale. And so we actually work kind of behind the scenes with a lot of the big corporate carbon removal purchasers today, which I think are doing really, really progressive and high impact work. When you think about what Stripe has set up, or kind of the Microsoft, Shopify set of companies that are buying carbon removal, Swiss Re from the finance industry, that's just ultimately an order of magnitude or two too small compared to what governments need to do. And I think we will hit a cliff where you have early leaders that are moving because they have corporate leadership that's willing to put resources behind this. But for every one company like that, there's 100 more that are just doing the minimum that they need to meet regulatory hurdles. So governments are going to have to step up and either buy this themselves or require that companies that say they're going to be net zero do so with a good fraction of carbon removal, and or say that net zero is not enough, and we have to clean up our legacy piece. And I think the other thing is that corporates matter a lot when it comes to policy. That at the end of the day, if private industry is doing this and advocating for governments to make it the standard or to do it themselves, it's way more powerful than if just an environmental group was talking about.
Great. Maybe we'll have one last quick thing before we wrap up is, I guess, do you have anything in mind that people in this talk or people generally could do in like civic society to kind of push carbon removal either through policy or through public consciousness? And yeah, what would you recommend to people kind of maybe on this call to get involved?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think we need civil society in dozens of geographies around the world working on carbon removal. And that's what I would encourage doing, is to figure out who the stakeholders are in your local geography and figure out how to get them to the scale that they need to be to scale carbon removal. And we'd be more than happy to chat offline. So James, I do apologize. I have to sign off here, but it's thank you again for the invite. It's lovely to get to talk to everybody. Wonderful set of questions, and yeah, I look forward to continuing the dialogue soon.
Great. Thanks so much. Thanks for your time. And yeah, have a good one.
James. Likewise. Bye, everyone.
See ya. Cool. Nice one. Boom. He's out. I've put 3 more things in the chat. Just same things as before. Upcoming talks. Yes, we have another upcoming talk on carbon removal. It's a podcast filmed with the Carbon Removal Show and also one of our other organizers. That's in about 2 weeks' time. And then we have other talks by Terra Praxis, another Founders Pledge grantee, which is at the end of the month. And Matthew, I think, is on this call, actually is giving a talk on electricity use and decarbonization in early March. There's lots of cool things coming up. But yeah, you can click on those links to find out more. And otherwise, I'll email everyone with these things tomorrow, plus a recording, a half recording, and the slideshows I used. Yes. Great, that's it. Thanks, everyone. Have a good Saturday evening. What an exciting Saturday, Carbon removal. And yeah, see you all next time.